Welcome to Called to Lead, a podcast series on pastoral leadership for today's church, presented by the Markey Center in Santa Clara University's graduate program in pastoral ministries. I'm your host, Dr. John Rinaldo. Join us and explore leadership in the Catholic Church through stories and conversations with pastors, ministers, and scholars. We connect theology with real-world ministry, highlighting how today's leaders answer God's call to build just and inclusive communities. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Called to Lead. I'm your host, Dr. John Rinaldo, and I'm so excited today to be joined by one of my favorite people in the ministry world, Mr. Christopher Wesley. Chris Wesley is the founder of Marathon Youth Ministry and has a ton of practical ministerial experience doing youth and young adult ministry, children's formation, technology, social media, all sorts of things. Chris, welcome to the Call to Lead podcast. I'm so excited you're here today.
Oh man, it is awesome and also a little strange to be here considering you were just on my podcast and we did a podcast for a long time. But man, I'm glad to be your guest. I really do appreciate it. This is gonna be fun.
Well, this is great because this is our first little season of Called to Lead, sponsored by the Markey Center for Leadership and Ministry at Santa Clara University. And so I'm just excited to have you be part of this new journey and this story as well. And so let's get into it, Chris. I'm really excited about you and your experience and what you bring to the table. But before we talk about all your experience in Marathon Youth Ministry, tell us a little bit about your own journey in youth ministry and what drew you into this crazy work of church.
So what drew me in was I needed money, which is not something you hear from a lot of people. But after college, I did a year of volunteer work with the Jesuit Volunteers. That's how I ended up in Baltimore, where I currently live. And towards the end of that year, I was like, I needed a job because I was dating my now wife, and was really, at that pinnacle of, after 4 years of college and a year of volunteering, had no clue what I wanted to do. So I found middle school youth ministry position online at a parish called Church of the Nativity. I said I could do this for a couple of years. And in that first year, just fell in love with youth ministry and God's calling for it. And I was in parish ministry for about 20 plus years. About a year ago, I stepped out of full-time parish ministry to pursue Marathon Youth Ministry full-time. And that's something that I had started about 9 years ago. Actually close to 10 years ago, believe it or not. And so, it was something that I just was always felt called to do. I got into youth ministry because I needed the money. But I stayed because that's what God called me to do, and I don't regret a single decision.
I think that's really true for a lot of us who went into ministry right after college. We're like, yeah, we want to
Hmm.
do ministry, but I also need a paycheck. So,
Right.
maybe it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a paycheck. So, and it
Hmm.
allowed you to pay for the dates that you needed to go on,
Just the dates. I mean, she ended up, especially after we got married, paying for everything else. But and that's still kind of the case today. But.
That's so funny. That's so funny. Well, you've been, again, involved in youth ministry for many, many years. What have been some of the experiences early on your ministry that have shaped how you understand young people in the church today? Obviously, when you first entered, the world was different. And now here we are, we're recording in 2026. We're in a different space. But tell us about those experiences and how that affects how you understand church and how you understand young people.
Yeah, I mean, so when I got involved in youth ministry, when I decided to take the job, I had the blessing of actually growing up in a parish that had youth ministry. So for me, it was kind of like I always wanted to do the youth ministry that I didn't really have, but took some aspects from that and realized real quickly that that was not going to work. And even though I was only 23, 24, and had siblings who were still in high school at the time that I did youth ministry or started in youth ministry, I recognized that I felt like I was still so far off. In fact, a mentor of mine, Doug Fields, said it to me and a bunch of other youth workers: if you're over the age of 25, you're no longer cool. And that was really hard to embrace and everything like that. And so I did everything that I could to understand youth culture. Now we're going back to the early 2000s, right? The aughts, as the kids say. And I sound so old just saying that right there.
Yeah. Yes, you
But
do.
I don't know about you, John, but I would go into the supermarkets and the newsstands of the teeny bopper magazines. Remember those?
Oh, yeah.
I would pull those out and read about, whether it was One Tree Hill or Hillary Duff, or I don't know. I can't believe I even remember those two things, and study the youth culture that way. But what I learned quickly was trends come and go. But the one thing that young people want are relationships, meaningful, deep relationships. And later on, through a bunch of different research, we've learned that they're searching for belonging, purpose, and identity. But that once I got a sense of that, it became a lot easier to walk alongside young people and learn a lot about them and learn that that's something that we all crave, even as adults.
It's a really beautiful sentiment. The idea that that really hasn't changed, right? Ultimately, it still comes down to authentic relationships, community building, which has always been a key aspect of youth ministry, always is a key aspect of church. The way we do it, the methodologies, the technologies are certainly changing. What young people are dealing with today is certainly changing a
Hmm.
lot, but they still need that connection. I know, as you know, you have teenagers in the house of your own kids, and I've got, one teenager and two just about to be teenagers, and that connection is really
Hmm.
powerful. I appreciate that. Okay. So, fast forward, you've started Marathon Youth Ministry, I don't know how many years ago. But clearly, there was something in your pastoral ministry experience that made you realize there was some sort of gap, that there was something that we needed to address in the church, certainly here in the United States. What was the gap that you were looking to fill when you started Marathon Youth Ministry?
Yeah, so Marathon Youth Ministry as a actual standard corporation business started in 2016, right? So about almost 10 years ago. But it actually started as a blog in 2006. So man, lots of milestones. To 20 years of Marathon Youth Ministry right there. And it started out as this reflection tool because I don't know about you, John, but I was my mom had shared with me the gift of journaling, and so when blogging came out, I was like, oh, an online journal, this is great. Not expecting anyone to read it, but as I started to go to different conferences and networks, I actually would discover that people were reading my blog. In fact, someone quoted me once to myself, not knowing that I had written that, and I had to pull up the blog on my computer to show them that, and it was like just kind of this moment of like, oh wow, I have actually something to say. I have a voice, an opinion that people are actually listening to, and so one of the reasons Marathon started out was a chance to just kind of share my story of what's going on. Now, I know that sounds a little selfish or self-centered in a way, but as a young youth minister, that was something where I wanted to know that I could sit at the table with all these other men and women who had been doing this for years and have something to contribute because, reaching young people was something that I was so passionate about. But over time, as I started to share that story, the story that of hey, this is what I'm learning and this is what I'm doing, started to become a story of this is why I'm tired and this is getting hard, and I'm starting to question this calling and everything, and people were really resonating with that, and it turned into a little bit of coaching and just walking with people, and as Marathon Youth Ministry as a blog and these books I was writing were taking off, I was also slowly burning out in my parish ministry position. And so in 2016, after just coming to my wits' end, I decided to step away from parish ministry for a little bit, take some time, reflect, and decide that I was going to take Marathon Youth Ministry and turn it into an organization that was going to accompany ministry leaders, especially those who serve along young people, and help them avoid burnout at any way possible that I could. And so in 2016, I established Marathon Youth Ministry as this coaching organization that was going to help men and women in ministry avoid some of the pitfalls that I'd faced and help them thrive and grow in that regards. So that's a little bit of the why Marathon Youth Ministry started. And where it's gone today is still pretty true, is we want to, help ministry leaders rediscover or discover the joy that comes with serving in ministry so that they can do this for the long haul. Because if there's sustainability in their ministry, they're going to be around, they're going to build sustainable relationships with the next generation, which will lead that next generation and their families closer to Christ.
It's really intriguing. I realize I've known you for about 10 years, Chris, and I've never heard that story because we've never talked about that. And so that's new to me, but it's beautiful because it gives me a whole higher level of appreciation, obviously, for the work that you're doing. And it was funny is that was the year, 2016, that you and I met for the first time at the NCCYM, National Conference for Catholic Youth Ministry Leaders, which was in the Diocese of San Jose that year.
Yeah, and actually, John, it's funny. I feel like we have talked about aspects, but reflecting on the story, you don't get a lot of clarity. Probably you didn't know this, but I had left parish ministry literally a month before we encountered each other in San Jose. And so it was like really hard because people were asking me about my previous parish and everything like that. And I was kind of like, I don't know how to say. You were even asking about a former podcast that I had been on that kind of like went away because of that and everything. And yeah, it was it was a humbling time, but being at that conference too, it was affirming because as soon as I was surrounded with other men and women in youth ministry or ministry with young people, I felt like that's exactly where I needed to be.
That's beautiful. That's what conferences like that do, right? It
Hmm.
reinvigorates us. So the term marathon obviously is a really beautiful term, right? Marathon youth ministry, like this is the long game. And professional runners would say if you're in a marathon, don't start out fast running because you're going to burn yourself out. You're not going to make it the 26.2 miles in that marathon. And so that metaphor is really powerful. But yet we know that there are people in ministry, not just youth ministry, but all sorts of ministry roles that don't last very long, don't make it
Hmm.
the 26.2 miles that are required really to play the long game to serve the church and to serve the people in the church. And so, um, looking at your current work with parishes, leaders, you do a lot of coaching. What does the current work, what do young people need that's different than maybe some of the traditional models that we've been used to over the last 20, 30, 40 years? How is traditional youth ministry need to shift and change, I guess is a better way of saying that.
Yeah, down at the core of it, not a lot of it does need to change. I mean, it goes back to those three things I had mentioned earlier. Young people want to know, where do I belong? Who am I? And what am I meant to do? Right? Belonging, identity, and purpose. Um, and I think it goes back, going back to your question. It's like, or all right, how is that presented? How are we giving that sense of belonging, identity, and purpose? I feel that what parishes sometimes do is default back to that old intellectual model or Catholic school model where we just need to get young people here. We'll preach them the truth, we'll show them beauty, and they'll automatically understand, right? And they're taking into consideration that all those things are things that people will just pick up just by experiencing them. And that's not to say that there aren't people who do that, but for the most part, we need to create situations where young people feel like they belong. So, one sort of strategy or methodology of youth ministry that I feel like has been time tested and still prevails is small group ministry. How you offer those small group ministries, that has changed. So let me give you an example. Back when I started out in youth ministry, the way that we offered small groups was at the end of a large group programming, right? And it was great because, before all these competitions that we had with sports and technology and all that kind of stuff, just having something fun, social, and exciting to get young people around, rally around, and then and then give them some kind of content and say, okay, now we're going to break that content down with you, was the best method at that time. Now that there are so many different like experiences and things that people need to engage in, it's not so much saying like how do we get young people into small groups that are hosted at the parish, but how do we create small group communities in their current life, right? So that's why you still see programs around like Young Life and Youth for Christ and some of these interdenominational organizations because they're in the schools. That's where young people are. That's why things like Fellowship of Christian Athletes is still around because they're going to the sports and doing small groups there. So I think as parishes, if we're going to utilize small groups, we have to not just say like, all right, how do we get kids on campus, but how do we get small groups, Catholic centered small groups into the community? And that's a little bit of a challenge because of child protection, logistics, a couple of different things. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's different. So I would say small groups is definitely one part. The other part that I'll mention, because there's a couple of other things, is putting young people's faith into action, right? And so, getting young people to serve, that's something that's been timeless as well. But now we're seeing that young people not only want to serve, but they want to serve with a purpose. And so faith justice, doing some kind of outreach opportunities, not making sandwiches, but actually interacting with people, helping them learn how to articulate and advocate and, do more than just show up and serve, but actually get involved and take leadership is definitely key. So small group communities and putting their faith into action, I think, are two of the top ways that parishes should approach ministry with young people.
I totally agree with you. One of the things I've discovered, though, looking at the landscape of literature or resources, is that I feel like there's a dearth, whatever that word means. I've heard someone say it, so I use the word. There's a dearth of resources that really support youth ministry leaders developing small groups. And I remember going back to the aughts, as you call them, or as whoever calls it that. There were resources, and I remember buying some of those resources. Now, most of them were not Catholic; they were coming from
Mhm.
like group publishing or simply youth ministry or some of those things, and they were really valuable. Are there resources today to help, leaders in the church develop small groups, and where are they and where do we find them?
Yeah, so I'll give a shout out to someone I've done some work with, Y Disciple. They have a lot of great small group strategy. They have small group curriculum too, but small group strategy and how to build those small groups. I know Project YM is another organization that has tackled small group strategies with some of the things that they have done and are doing. And then yeah, Marathon Youth Ministry. We have with our ministry to go subscription, some tools to help you establish small groups, give small group leaders job descriptions and things along those lines. So those things are out there. But I'll tell you what, John, like the the first question that a lot of people have is, okay, what are we going to do in small groups? And I would say like the simplest thing that you can do is take the Sunday liturgy, the gospel, and do a kind of a relaxed version of Alexio Divina as a way to sort of have content to reflect on. But when you gather, make that a welcoming environment. Make sure that you're checking in with those young people and seeing what's on their hearts and their minds well before you even get into the content. Make it about them before you make it about what you want to teach. And then just spend time listening and getting to know them and asking the Holy Spirit to guide you in those conversations and in those experiences, because then the content, the theology, our faith it will be clear exactly what truths we need to speak into those young people's lives. But yeah, Project YM, Y Disciple, and then of course going to the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministry, they'll have good links to different resources that you can use for sure.
Excellent. That's really helpful. I love that you distinguish the idea that you don't really need to start with content first,
Right.
right? It's the environment, it's the experience, it's the community, as you said earlier in this episode. And how do we get people to build community? And then the content will flow from that, especially as we get to know the students and figure out what are the questions that they have. And let's actually, as I often say, let's actually answer the questions young people are asking
Hmm.
versus answering questions that they're not asking. Right? And I
Yeah,
think that the only way we can do that is be in relationship with them.
yeah, and I would even say like don't be afraid to start what I call them affinity groups. If you have someone in your parish that loves young people and also loves to cook and is good at cooking, and you have an industrial sized kitchen in your church, which most places do, make a cooking class, right? That's one way to get them on campus and use that to talk. I mean, food is so tied to our faith, right? That's one way. My youngest son loves Dungeons and Dragons, and granted, he does that at a local game board club. But if I know plenty of people in church who love Dungeons and Dragons, host a D&D night. There's so many moralistic questions and challenges that appear in those D&D campaigns that they do. Use that to preach the faith. Maybe it's just regular board games. Maybe it's art or music or something along those lines. Don't be afraid to use that as the catalyst to start the discussions.
Sure, Monopoly is a great game to talk about Catholic social teaching
Yeah,
and
right,
social
right.
justice, right? So,
It could make that
um,
fun a lot less fun though.
oh yeah,
So,
this is true. This is true. Now, what does
Yeah.
this say that your goal is to bankrupt everybody else? What
Yeah,
should we
right.
reflect on? Oh my gosh. Well, I know nothing about D&D other than it's been around for a long time, so I might have to do a little more research on that.
Yeah.
But to your point, my kids are very much into the theater and music and arts and band, and so I obviously they're my own children, so I'm throwing myself into it. But the beautiful thing as a parent is that I'm now building relationships with all my high schoolers friends. And
Hmm.
so in some ways, I will always be a youth minister, right, Chris?
Right,
And
right.
so, I tell my daughters, like, we want this space to be a space that you feel comfortable inviting your friends. We want to get to know your friends,
Hmm.
and so having the home be that, I think is really powerful, especially for those of us that are parents. All right,
Yeah.
so switching gears, kind of looking at the real needs, right? You talked about community building, you talked about small groups. What's the biggest challenge today for the church in connecting and building good ministry to young people?
Whew, that's a loaded question. That's an important question to ask. So before I answer what the challenge is, let me share with you some of the data that's come out there in regards to which attributes to the challenge. So, about a year ago, there was a report that came out that said about the majority of churches out there, and this isn't just Catholic, but churches out there invest only 2 to 5% of their annual income in youth ministry, and that includes the salaries of the men and women who serve in that. So, again, if you're a parish that's bringing in $100,000 a year, you're only spending $2 to 5,000 on that youth ministry program, right? So that brings up the question of, um, are you yielding your investment, right? And in most cases, if that's the situation, that shouldn't be surprising if you're only doing 2 to 5%. The other thing that we're seeing is, and this was a report that came out from Fuller Youth Institute, sorry, is that the number one reason why ministry leaders leave their position, youth ministers leave their position, is because they're feeling overloaded, right? That was the number one, overloaded. Second reason was because of disagreements or not seeing eye to eye with leader or challenges with leadership, whether that was the pastor or their supervisor. And the third reason was pay, right? So there's obviously, I would say, the number one challenge to doing youth ministry effectively, and this is probably true with a lot of other ministries, is that there are far few people doing the work of many, and we're not doing enough to invest in the longevity of those individuals. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of high expectations without the capacity to execute on those expectations.
And those are structural questions, right?
Hmm.
Everything you just named, it has everything to do with the structure of the parish or the church versus programs, curriculum, strategy around connecting with young people, right? You said burnout, you said pay, and misalignment on vision,
Hmm.
right? In
Right.
terms of that. And so the challenge that I have when I work with my students at Santa Clara University and with the coaching that I do is the comment that uh, a lot of people say is like, I wish clergy, I wish pastor could hear some of this. And I know, Chris, you and I have talked about that before, where I don't need clergy, I don't need pastors to be experts in everything, right? That's
Right.
unrealistic, right? They're trying to run an entire parish, and it's more complex than most of us know. But I want them to have at least some sort of understanding of the vision and the strategy and what works and what doesn't. And so there's work that needs to be done there. But again, as numbers decrease, as offertory decreases, the finance councils and pastoral councils and the pastor get into this interesting situation. It's like we have limited resources. Where do we put that? 2 to 5% is quite sad, but I understand it compared to like we gotta maintain facilities, for
Right.
instance, and that's
Right.
expensive. It's
Right.
expensive.
And yeah, and it's not to say that there aren't other things that are important with that, but I think it's just important for us to ask the question, how can we prioritize young people further, right? So maybe it's not necessarily adjusting the budget, but like looking at different ways that young people can get involved, right? The ways that we talk about it. I think the other problem or the other challenge, John, and I wish we would talk about this more, is I don't think we clearly understand what the return on the investment should or could look like, right? I mean, I think we all know and believe that if you invest in the young church, you'll see thriving and growing churches. But for people who are looking at budgets and structures and, systems and everything like that, what's the actual tangible? Now, I don't think we can say like for every, $10 you spend in a young person, you should expect like 100 in return or whatever. I mean, maybe we'll get to a point where the statistics can come out there, but I think that parishes have to recognize that, especially in today's day and age, where our generation's maybe a little bit more jaded and the younger generation is a little bit more interested in faith. If you get more young people into your church, you do something for my kid, you do something for me, I'm going to probably come back to that church and I'm going to spend money on that church. And personally, I know that because I can't believe how much money I spend every year on baseball and Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. Like, just those two things alone. Right. That's because my kids are highly interested in that. And those places and programs do so much for my kids. I'm going to invest in that. So your giving will go up if you invest in young people. Not only that, you'll never have that volunteer problem of who's going to step up and do this. Because if you invest in young people and have them serve, as they become young adults and then, mature adults and everything like that, they're going to be able to not just lead and step into positions, but have those years of experience and know how to help that parish grow, whether it's strategically or financially or, however those needs emerge. So those are like some of the ways that we have to look at that return on the investment, especially when it comes to young people.
That's awesome. I totally agree with that, right? The amount of money I've spent on band, theater, cheer is absolutely ridiculous, right? So
Right.
that's the world I'm in as a parent. And so I agree 100%. Let's end on a high note here, Chris. Last question for you. What gives you hope when you look at the future of youth ministry in the church?
I mean, what gives me hope are the young people themselves. I mean, the fact that I love how as a church we not intentionally, but try to sabotage our efforts as best as possible. Yet God always prevails. And being the father of two teenagers and seeing that their love for the church is growing. And yeah, I can take a little credit for that as their parent and as their youth minister. But the fact that the church as a whole has been there and has shown that, I think is huge. I have great hope in the fact that Pope Leo has done such an excellent job of speaking to young people and speaking to the things young people care about. It's not a knock against Francis or Benedict or John Paul II. It's just right now, like we have a pope that is doing what he needs to reach this next generation, and that was definitely evident at the last National Catholic Youth Conference when he came in through video and spoke live to our young people. So I have a lot of hope. I think the church is never dead, and it's not dead. It'll continue to prevail, and I just want to be a part of it.
Amen to that. I totally agree with you on that. Chris, thank you so much for being part of this episode called The Lead. We really appreciate all you're doing for the church, starting with the domestic church at home with your own family, but then serving all these leaders across the country. If people want to find out more information about you, Chris, where are they going to find out that info?
They just need to go to marathonyouthministry.com. That's our website. That's where you can see us on Instagram. We're at Marathon Youth Ministry. And find me with my name, Christopher Wesley, on LinkedIn. And last but not least, make the church podcast the second podcast you listen to after Call to Lead. So
I love it. I love it. The church podcast also, you can find that on Marathon Youth Ministry as well. All right, Chris, thank you so much again for joining us. That wraps up another episode of Call to Lead, presented by the Markey Center for Leadership in Ministry at Santa Clara University's graduate program in pastoral ministries. Look forward to seeing you at the next episode. God bless you all. Have a great day.